enemies to you. So your encampments must be holy. He must not see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. So it really emphasized the reasoning for the holiness.
Yes, it does.
And then as we, as the temple of God, need to consider that if we to keep on the path and to imitate his holiness.
Absolutely. And one of the ways they stood apart was that, you come into a camp of the Israelites, if they were faithful, and the camps were clean and hygienic. And the people were wholesome. They didn't have body piercings. They didn't have tattoos. They didn't have crazy mohawk haircuts. They looked clean and wholesome, and their camps were clean and wholesome, and they were less likely to get ill as a result. Pretty interesting. Todd, comment?
Yeah, this is a great lesson. It's amazing as we look at Leviticus how things open up. I just really thankful for this, but I just, when you brought out Numbers chapter 15 and just the insignificance of picking up sticks on the Sabbath, that seems so insignificant to us. But it's interesting if as you look at the New Testament, it's always telling us to fear God and worship him in a certain way. I mean, it just emphasizes to me, all these Old Testament things that happen. In this instance, in Numbers 15, just how serious God takes what he says. He says he means what he says, and he says what he means. He must be treated as holy. And what a great attitude to have as we worship him and just as we're thinking about his church and everything else, how seriously we need to take it. I mean, these little things that we might think that are small are just so big and so important.
Yep, and that's clearly one of the lessons we're supposed to get. Again, the number one thing we do is love God. One of the ways we show we love God is being conscientious about learning and then following his commandments, right? Absolutely. Good thoughts. Okay, remember, the word holy and its derivatives occurs 85 times in these 11 chapters. So this is all about learning to be separate from the world, not like the world, but separate from the world. And then there were these special regulations for the priest. This is in Leviticus 21 and 22. Some of these are a little surprising. Some of them were regulations for all Israelites that are just reiterated here. And some of them were special regulations for the priests themselves before they could serve in the holy place and represent the people before God. Kind of reminds me of the qualifications for shepherds or elders or pastors. Some of the things that it says are things that are given to all Christians. Quite a few of them, in fact, really are true for all Christians. All Christians should strive to be blameless, not just elders, right? And then there are some that are just specifically for elders, like being a husband of one wife. You don't have to be married to go to heaven, but you have to be married to be a shepherd, and you have to have the experience of raising a family and be successful at that. So there are certain things that are specific for elders, not necessarily for just anyone. And you're going to find the same thing is true here with these regulations for the priest. A priest must not make himself unclean by touching a corpse, and there were a few exceptions given. And again, if you're unclean, it doesn't mean you've sinned necessarily. It just means you have touched death or someone who has died, and you need to be careful after you've done that you stay away from others. Now, there are some hygienic rules that makes sense. If someone has died, it's very possible that they died from some sort of bacterial infection, right? And they're filled with that, and then if you, in preparing the body for burial, expose yourself to that, you might get sick and the people you infect. So there's that practical aspect, but then there's the spiritual aspect of God is life, and he's the source of all life. And if you touch something associated with death or dying, you need to recognize you become unclean, unholy, And there's a waiting period before you can be considered cleansed and then be put back into a place where you can come into God's presence, because you're a holy people. So all these different things that he gives them to just remind them that you're separate, you're different, you're my people, you're my treasure, and I want you to act differently than everybody else. Verse 5, they're not to shave their heads, shave the edges of their beards, or cut their bodies. Now that's a specific reference, I think, to don't be like the pagan priest who, like the prophets of Baal, were gnashing and cutting upon themselves to try to get the attention of Baal. Because their concept of God is not that their gods are omniscient. I mean, their idea is that their gods are limited, and so maybe you have to really speak loudly so he can hear you. And so Elijah's mocking them, saying, oh, well, maybe he's out on a long journey. Maybe he can't. Go ahead. Scream louder. Well, we serve a God that he hears our prayers when we pray them silently, just as well as if we're up on the rooftop screaming at the top of our lungs. And so he tells them these things. Don't cut your bodies. You don't have to do anything like that to get my attention, like is true with the pagan gods and the pagan worship. And then he says, of course, you must not profane God's name. That's one of those things that would be true for any Israelite. But especially that's true of someone who's going to be a priest, who's going to come in God's presence. They're not going to use profanity, taking holy things and treating them as if they're common. Or they're not going to misuse God's name, taking God's name and maybe their position as a priest and try to bless things that are ungodly in God's name, which is another way you could profane his name. Must not marry a harlot. Well, I don't know why anybody would want to do that. But then it goes on and says, or a divorced woman, or a widow. Now, there's nothing wrong with marrying a widow or a widower. Nothing wrong with that. You're not married forever. When you die, the marriage bond is severed, and you're not married in heaven. Jesus said there's no marriage or giving of marriage in heaven. But if you're going to come before God in worship, the priest, we're told specifically, to only marry someone that was a virgin and not to marry anyone else. Just a higher standard, just to elevate them in some way. A priest's daughter must be morally pure. If not, she is to be burned with fire. So again, a reflection upon his offspring is a reflection upon him and his ability to serve. Regulations for the priest: he must have been anointed with a special olive oil and wear priestly clothes. I found this really curious. He must not let his hair go uncombed. My wife likes that. In other words, if you're going to come before God, you need to be neat and clean and have special garments. So, one of the chimney corner scriptures is cleanliness is next to godliness. The Bible doesn't ever come out and say that, but there's a principle there, I think. Neatness here is next to godliness. So in spite of a lot of the pictures of Jesus with long hair kind of uncombed, no indication Jesus had long hair, and my guess is if the hair he had was combed, then he looked neat and wholesome, just like a priest would have been. Yes, Les.
Well, this rule or regulation sort of goes with when you put someone outside the tent, outside the city, outside the camp, unkempt hair or torn clothes. And it says the same thing about priests here.
Yes. Yeah,
They might be mistaken. Someone might mistake them as being unclean in some way.
yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Les. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I think one of the ways a leper identified himself as a leper is he wasn't to comb his hair, so people would recognize him even from a far distance. And so if that indicated uncleanliness, then having the hair combed would indicate things are in order and that they are clean. Interesting. Thank you, Les. Anybody else? All right. And the high priest, as I said, could only marry a virgin. No blemish allowed for the priest to serve in the high priesthood. So, does that remind you of anything? Jesus is our Passover lamb. And what does it say about the Passover lamb? 1 year old, male, and what? Without any noticeable blemish, which is supposed to represent this is like the best that you have. You're not giving God the scraps. And I think, of course, it has reference to the fact that Jesus was a perfect sacrifice. He had no sin, no blemish. We remember his sacrifice in the Lord's Supper by partaking of matzos, unleavened bread. So that here we have that in common. And this kind of surprises people. What do you think about this? No one with physical handicaps could serve. They could eat the bread but not offer it or be chosen to go into the high priest, the Holy of Holies. It specifies, verse 18, he shall not approach a blind man or a lame man, he that hath this is funny, a slit nose. Not sure what that has to, maybe some sort of like cleft palate kind of thing. I don't know. Or anything that is superfluous, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or crook-backed, or a dwarf that hath a blemish in his eye, or is scurvy, or scabbed, or hath his stones broken. No man of the seed of Aaron the priest that hath a blemish shall come nigh to offer the offerings of Jehovah made by fire. He hath a blemish, he shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God. This is about the most politically incorrect passage I could ever think of. First of all, nothing wrong with somebody having a handicap or having some sort of blemish of this kind of thing. Nothing wrong with being a Mephibosheth. He was dropped at his birth, and as a result, he was a cripple the rest of his life in the Old Testament. And he was sat there at David's table, and because he was Jonathan's son, David gave him special privileges, which was a great act of kindness. And there's lots of things earlier that warns about taking advantage of handicapped people, remember? You steal from a typical person, you have to pay a fine, sometimes up to 4 times. But if you take advantage and steal from a handicapped person, it was the death penalty. So God protected the handicapped. He didn't look down upon them. But if you're going to be the one that comes into God's presence, he says, you don't offer an animal that has some sort of handicap or blemish, and I don't want one of my priests that happens to have one of these handicaps to be the one you select to go into my presence on the Day of Atonement on the Holy of Holies. Just because it's the idea of presenting your best. Again, I'm kind of surprised that this is there. But that's just because it seems so uncomfortable to read it because it's so politically incorrect in our day. So it's not a statement of that you're less of a person if you have this thing. It's just that it could disqualify you from having this particular privilege as you come into God's presence in the Holy of Holies once a year. Any thoughts or comments about that? Yes, Adam.
Well, I guess the real value of this is that even though it's difficult to consider all of these things and these various blemishes, that it would have made us so aware of our imperfections under the old law, and even into certain parts of the gospel. But when you read about what Christ did, that as blemished as all of us are, that we all have, I mean, these physical defects really represent in some ways our spiritual defects and our sins, that is, as blemished as we all are, God made it possible for all of us to be brought close. And so that's why this is so valuable to appreciate, is that it really drives that point home.
Yeah, but Jesus, who is the ultimate high priest, right? He's the king priest. He was not blemished at all. So this is just a way, I think, of theologically pointing that out. And I think it's more the spiritual application than the actual reference to somebody with some sort of physical problem like that. Thank you. Well said. Spoken like a gospel preacher. Okay, anybody else? Okay. If an unclean priest approaches the holy things, he is forbidden from ever appearing in my presence. So if you're ceremonially unclean and you go ahead and serve and don't let people know, and then that's found out, then you can't ever be one of the ones that gets to serve in the holy place. You know, it was considered such a privilege to do this. And so many people wanted to serve in the holy place. And there were more priests than there were people needed to do this, that they would cast lots. And it was like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. If you found that the lot fell on you and your family, and you passed all the inspections, and you got to do this, it was just such a privilege. And if it ever happened by chance that the lot fell on you twice, out of an act of courtesy, you would pass over it and let someone else have a chance. At least that was what Josephus said. Another thing that Josephus said that I thought was really cool is only the high priest on the Day of Atonement could go into the Holy of Holies. And you had to do all these things and wear all these special garments and all that, lest you die. And the people would be outside waiting for him to come out after having made sacrifice first for his own sins and then for the people. And then you'd receive the priestly benediction. And that time while you're waiting was known as the sweet hour of prayer. We sometimes sing that, and I don't think we realize what we're singing. It's not just any sweet hour of prayer. You would be praying and quietly listening to the priest as he goes about the different articles of furniture. And you would know which he would do first. You know, the table of showbread, and then the oil and the candelabra, and then burning incense, and then finally going behind the veil and then sprinkling the blood on the mercy seat. And what did God set up so the people on the outside who were benefiting from what this high priest is doing for them, what did he set up in the clothing of the high priest so that they would know what he was doing and they could kind of track his presence in this sweet hour of prayer? Yes, they had bells. There was bell and a pomegranate, and pomegranates were considered royalty in that day. So you had bells and pomegranates. And so you could, when he would move, the bells would ring. And so you knew that the priest was okay and that he was doing his priestly duties. And the Pharisees thought, well, what happens if the fella has a heart attack in there? What if he does something wrong and he's struck dead and nobody can go in there to get him because nobody else is allowed in there but this special high priest? So does anybody know how they handled that? Josephus says they tied a rope around his right ankle. And that way, if they ever needed to, if he didn't come out on his own, they could pull him out without going in to get him out. Isn't that interesting? Crystal's going, not so much, Brent. Bizarre. But that's the link they went to make sure they didn't violate some of these principles. If one becomes unclean for any reason, then the priest must wait until they have been cleansed before they can return to their service. If they defile anything, they will die. Wow, this is serious. You needed to really take this service serious. Remember, the New Testament equivalent is all of us, as we live our lives and offer ourselves as living sacrifices, as modern-day disciples, we're involved in this priestly duty. Not just when we do some formal worship, but just as you live your life outside the camp, trying to testify to sinners of how much better it is inside the camp. Only a priest's family can eat of the holy offerings, no one else. And if one eats holy offerings by mistake, that person must reimburse the priest's family plus pay at a 20% penalty. Boy, wouldn't that have been odd to have lived in the Old Testament era and been an Israelite? And what a privilege that all of us, men and women, can be priests in the new covenant. Because these people were really special and exalted in the Old Testament. The gifts once offered become holy. Priests must not treat them as common. So again, you didn't treat them in some common way. Just like with the Passover. If you're done with the Passover meal, you don't save the leftovers and eat them the next day for breakfast in a common meal. You had to destroy those things. That's why I don't think we ought to let the kids eat the leftovers of the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. It's just treating it in a common way. Once it's set aside for a holy purpose, it ought to be treated with respect and reverence, and then it's just disposed of, but never used in a common way. One of the examples I think is helpful is people sometimes are not sure. What do you mean some things are clean and some things are unclean, and some things are holy and some things are unholy? And how does that help us today? Well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going to Burger King and having a Whopper for lunch. In fact, I think they make a pretty good burger. It's just a common meal. You can go to any restaurant you want and have a common meal. But God forbid that someone would take that Whopper and use it on the Lord's table. Just a common thing we typically eat, instead of use the sacred elements that He has authorized that go all the way back to the Passover and the Passover meal. People go, oh yeah, I see the difference now. Yeah. In fact, you could have matzah bread if you want as a part of a meal if you choose to, but it's not the same as when you consecrate it with prayer, and on the Lord's Day you eat it in remembrance of Jesus. See, those things are holy elements. Don't confuse the common with the holy. Okay. Foreigners who live in the land may offer burnt offerings to me. That's interesting. So you didn't have to be an Israelite necessarily. God would accept offerings from people who were believers, even though they weren't Israelites by blood. Does He do that throughout the Old Testament? When Rahab offered to become one of them and turn on her own people, did God accept her faith? In fact, she's in the Faith Hall of Fame. It's always been God's plan that this not be something about ethnicity, but that this be based upon faith. But of course, it had to meet certain criteria to do that. You must not leave the meat of an animal sacrificed unto me until morning. Same idea of treating it in a reverent and respectful way. Then there's a final admonition again to them about holiness. Let's look at that. 22, let's see here, 31. Therefore shall you keep my commandments and do them, for I am Jehovah, and you shall not profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am Jehovah who halloweth you. That's the verb form of holy. So I'm the one who's making you holy, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, for I am Yahweh. I am Jehovah. Okay, what do we learn that's relevant today? Anything else that we haven't talked about yet? What are your thoughts? How does this apply to us today as modern day priests? As we serve directly our God through our King Priest Jesus. Todd?
Well, Jesus says that we must worship him in spirit and truth, in John chapter 4, I believe. And then, just looking at the way the priests dressed and their attitudes of, if they did something unclean, they had to bow out, and if they didn't, they got forever banished from doing that. I mean, just all those things just make me think of what a privilege it is to be just like a worship leader or a song leader. You want to give your best. I like to wear a tie, and I like to dress nice when I'm worshiping God. And I think all these principles in Leviticus are so relevant to us. When we worship God, we worship him in decency and in order and all these things. So those are some of the things that I think that are relevant.
Okay. I agree. Anybody else? Okay, so let's look at the religious worship calendar just for a few moments in the time we have left. I've talked to you about this before. Leviticus 23, he lays out a summary statement about the calendar. It's called the redemptive calendar, about these Jewish feasts and festivals that was such an important part of the life of the Israelites and later on the Jews. And we'll talk more about that next week. In the time we have left, I want us to jump over to Numbers 10, because there's this whole chapter about the importance of the trumpets. And it goes along with the Feast of the Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, which was the celebration of their civil New Year. What was their religious New Year? What was the marking of that calendar? The Passover. And why would that be? Because that was their beginning as a what? As a nation. God called them out of Egypt, and so their freedom as a people was given to them on the Passover. So that was the beginning of their religious calendar. But they also had a civil calendar, and Rosh Hashanah is like the Feast of the Trumpets. Now, in the Old Testament, God specifically told them that you had to beat out these trumpets, and you had to do it in a certain way. They had to be flat, and there's the specific trumpets that they were supposed to use, and they were used for certain purposes, and theologically they're tied in to the New Testament. So all of these different feasts have spiritual realities that they look forward to. And I want us to grasp the Feast of the Trumpets here as we close. Make 2 trumpets out of hammered silver. Use them to call the community together and as a signal to break camp. It was a means of communication. Obviously, they didn't have modern means of communication, but if you're circled around the camp and you heard these trumpets blown in a certain way, based on how you blew the trumpet, it was kind of like Morse code. It was the way they would know certain things. Josephus says they were near a cubit long, the tube of the thickness of a common pipe or flute, the mouth no wider than just to admit blowing into them, and the ends wide like those of a modern trumpet. And they're mentioned in 2 Kings and in 2 Chronicles. And they were unique, not like the trumpets you would have found in Egypt or other places. So God specified all these details about the way he wanted them to use these trumpets. They weren't allowed to just use anything they wanted or something they got from Egypt. What was their purpose? Verse 2, to call the people together for worship. And also to tell them it's time to journey. I mean, what if you're taking a nap? Or what if it's the middle of the night and suddenly the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire begins to move? It would move without warning. And then they all had to break camp. And they had to take the articles of furniture and carry it on these poles. They weren't allowed to touch it, but they would carry it on these poles. And they'd begin this procedure led by the priest, and the people were to follow as they would carry their tents with them. And they had to wait until the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire stopped. And then once they realized that it would stop, they'd build the Holy of Holies around it so it would be hovering above it. And all of that was directed by these trumpets. And also, if there was a time to gather together and have a national feast, that was another thing that they would do with these trumpets to notify the people what to do. And if you were under attack like they were by the Amalekites, then they would blow something else. And then everybody would say, oh, it's the alarm. We have the same thing today, really. The emergency broadcast network, right? And suddenly everything, Amber Alerts. They had this other sound that was, get ready, grab your sword, defend yourself. We are under attack. He says, you do these things, and notice that I am the Lord your God. He is their authority. And it was a constant reminder of his presence as he would protect them from attacks, give them food for their journey, give them notice so they could prepare to follow him, because he was the only thing that gave certainty in the wilderness where nothing seemed certain. And so later on, they're going to have this special feast of the trumpets. So what does the New Testament say Jesus is going to return with? He's going to come with the sound of a what? Sound of the trumpet. It says, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout and with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet of God. Time to journey home. Time to follow Jesus all the way to heaven when we are caught up to meet him in the air. And the trumpet sound will let you know the second coming is here. But I want you to think about something else I think is really cool. This was going to be the signal of the beginning of our fellowship, of our feast with God in heaven. But it's also the sound of the trumpet for those of us that just can't wait for the Lord to come and take us home. And sometimes pray, Maranatha, Lord, come quickly. For those that aren't ready, that are just living for this life and aren't ready to meet the Lord, the sound of that trumpet is not going to be a sweet sound. It's going to be an alarm. It's the international emergency broadcast signal. But sadly, once you hear that, it's too late to do anything about it. The day of grace is over. The day of judgment has come. And so we want to hear the sound of the trumpet if we're ready to meet him, but that's the last thing we want to hear if we're not. When the Lord Jesus will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, dealing out retribution upon those that do not know God and have not obeyed the gospel. So the gospel trumpet has this distinct sound that arrests our attention. It's either good news or bad news. It sounds the alarm to sinners, but proclaims liberty to the captives. It's the ultimate jubilee and time to celebrate as he collects the worshipers of God from the four corners of the earth and takes us home. And he stirs them up in holy combat and assures them of the ultimate victory. So, Rosh Hashanah. What do we do sometimes at New Year's Eve parties? We blow those horns, when the ball crosses and it's 12. That goes back to this. It's the new year, a new journey. And we just started in 2022, a new year. And it ought to be a reminder that we have to be ready, because we never know when the sound of the trump's going to come. And we watch and pray while we're waiting for his return. Just like they waited for the high priest to come out and give them the priestly benediction, we wait for the ultimate blessing for the Lord when he returns to take us home. Isn't the Bible amazing? The more I study this, I think, anyway, anybody could have made this up? Are you kidding me? Thank you all for being here tonight. And we'll pick up with the next section of Leviticus next week. We'll be looking at Leviticus 26 and 27 and Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Okay? Thank you. God bless. Thanks for being here.